Pompeii, a small town in the provinces, 25,000 inhabitants, a comfortable life, many luxurious villas, grapevines that produced the richest wines for Rome, very fertile land on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, a volcano dormant for centuries. Pompeii was founded by an Italic people around the 8th century BC, a fortified city some 135 miles south of Rome. At the end of the 5th century, the Samnites ruled Pompeii. In the course of the Samnite War, the Romans occupied Pompeii, then signed an alliance with her. During the so-called Social War, when half Italy was in revolt because Rome had refused to grant it citizenship, the Roman general Sulla laid siege to Pompeii. Time passed. Pompeii became Romanized. In the year 80 before Christ, it became a Roman colony. Colonia Cornelia Veneria Pompeianorum. Its fortified walls no longer served a military function. Pax Romana prevailed. Rich families from Rome began to move in and intermarried with the Samnites of Pompeii. For the next 100 years, the annals provide no information about Pompeii. Life continued quietly, uneventfully. The sleepy mediocrity of life in the provinces. I was waiting for you.
Where were we?
An August day in Pompeii.
August of the year 79 A.D.
It was an ordinary day, very hot. But despite the heat, there was a lot of action in the streets and in the stores. Everybody was busy doing something, or nothing. Pompeii was a bustling little town.
We think of Pompeii as an unexciting kind of place. Nothing extreme, just elegant, tasteful, a rich person's town.
The life of Pompeii was tied to the land.
Which was naturally owned by a few wealthy people.
Not the way it was in Rome. Most property holdings were less than 100 jugeri.
About 60 acres.
With annual earnings of about 30,000 sesterces.
About $1,000.
Not much of a return on investment, which explains why many landowners preferred to rent out their land to tenant farmers and spend their own time in trade. At the mouth of the river, there was a bustling seaport. The Pompeians exported their excellent wines to Gaul. Some Pompeians worked very hard, others did no work at all. I used to come here often. In one way or another, every Pompeian had to deal with Caecilius Jocundus, the banker.
This is where they found 150 clay tablets detailing his accounts.
Caecilius entered his figures on these tablets. Loans made, business transactions, sales. 2,000 sesterces. Lucius Caecilius Jocundus, having agreed to the stipulated sum, Lucius Titius acknowledges receipt of this entire amount, less 2% for expenses for the sales made by the same Lucius Titius. written at Pompeii on the 15th day before the calends of Januarius, under the consulship of Drusus and Clodius.
And Caecilius Secundus kept the 2%?
That was his fee, a kind of bank charge. Caecilius had the right to impose certain taxes.
$6,000 sesterces paid to a certain Stalius Inventus for ager vectigalis.
Yes, a tax for the use of public land.
Caecilius Secundus's house must have been quite something.
It was beautiful, but hardly splendid. Just a typical well-to-do businessman's house. People lived very well in Pompeii. The cost of living was much lower than in Rome.
What about the not-so-rich?
A pound of bread cost less than an ass. An amphora of good wine, the local Falerno, 3 asses. The daily cost of food for a family like mine was perhaps 11 or 12 asses per person.
About $1 a day per person. Let's see now. 1 ass was worth about 8.5 cents. 4 asses were equal to 1 sesterce. 4 sesterces equaled 1 denarius. 20 denarii made 1 aureus.
Look, we're here. This was my house. I lived here with my wife and my 3 children and some slaves. My wife's family came from Rome, but I myself am descended from Samnites.
Even the style of the houses in Pompeii shows that same dual heritage, part Italic Samnite, part Hellenistic Roman. How come there are 2 atriums in your house?
In Rome, there was a shortage of space. Here we have more room, so our houses are much larger.
Your house is over 30,000 square feet.
The day began at sunrise. A bell was struck, and a small army of slaves sprang into action. Green palm fronds to sweep the floors and then polish them. Sponges tied to long poles to wash the floors and ceilings. I always used to get up at the first light of day.
Perhaps because your bedroom wasn't designed for lazing about during the day.
It's true. The cubiculum was the smallest room in the house. There was barely enough room for a bed, a stool to sit on, and a brazier. And the lasanum, of course.
The chamber pot. Despite their sense of delicacy, few Pompeians had what we would call hygienic toilet facilities in their houses.
The cubiculum had only one tiny window. No glass, just wooden shutters. An oil lamp for illumination, and a small wood-burning stove for warmth.
The air inside the bedroom must have been stale and smoky, particularly in the wintertime. You slept on a bed without sheets and fully clothed.
That way I was ready to go as soon as I got up. All I had to do was tie on my sandals and toss my mantle over my tunic.
Those ultra-cultured Romans slept in their clothes and didn't wash.
We did wash, but later, at the Thermae, the public baths. Everybody went there, rich and poor, every day. The Thermae were open from 7 in the morning.
All day.
Until nightfall. This was the triclinium estivo, where we dined in summer. I had 3 triclinia, one for summer, one for winter, and one for spring and autumn. The head of the household used to start his day with...
breakfast.
No, just a glass of water. The day began with my dependents coming to pay their formal respects.
What an archaic ritual. Every single morning, a powerful man would receive all his freedmen, slaves who bought their freedom or were rewarded with it, and everyone else who depended on him for support, connections, business.
It wasn't just an empty ritual. It was actually a very practical way for a businessman to keep on top of his business interests, find out what's happening in town and out of town as well.
A little like reading the morning newspaper.
Exactly. The master of the house, in this case I, sat here in the center of the atrium. my clients filed past. They were received not in the order in which they arrived, but according to their social rank.
That must have meant a very long wait for the freedmen, for the ones with the lowest rank.
Like everyone else, they got a sportula, a small gift of a coin. I had a lot of clients, so I spent a small fortune every day.
That was the custom. They expected it from you.
I had my own higher-ups to whom I had to report. So every day, after I had received my own clients, I myself had to go and pay homage to my patrons. This extended chain of protocol took up 3 or 4 hours every morning.
Time for the Romans was always a bit vague, an approximation. Particularly for Roman women, time was an imprecise concept. A Roman matron's day passed slowly and uneventfully. Otium, idleness, was the occupation of Pompeii's wealthy women.
The men paid the bills, never the women. My wife spent mornings in her rooms, beautifying herself. That's all she did. Makeup for the women of Pompeii was a very complicated business, applied each day by highly trained slaves. Neck and face were painted white with chalk. Lips and cheeks were reddened with dregs of wine, lashes blackened with soot or antimony. And the hairdos were just as complicated. Braided hairpieces piled sky-high, made from black hair that was imported from India, and often bleached blonde with a special soap.
That's the way the rich men and women lived. But for the bulk of the population of Pompeii, the morning hours were spent working.
True. Here at the port of Herculaneum, there was a lot of stir and bustle from the very start of day. Carts bringing farm produce from the countryside, merchants arriving with their wares, mules and muleteers stationing themselves along the streets. The center of the road was for vehicles, with 2 strips at the side for pedestrians. Look at these holes. That's where the legs of the benches were anchored on which the shopkeepers displayed their wares. The stores opened right onto the street. The streets of Pompeii were very crowded and busy. It was very noisy. Inside the store, a ladder reaching upstairs to an alcove for sleeping. This is a typical Pompeian store. Business on the ground floor, and above it, the living quarters.
And if a storekeeper was ever late in paying his rent, the landlord just took away the ladder so that the poor man would have no way to reach his upstairs lodgings.
It was the only way to get people to pay their debts.
Pompeians seem to have been all business and no heart.
One of the most profitable businesses was that of the Folones.
The cloth makers.
On that particular August morning, I went to visit Veranius Ipseo to pick out some fabric. He was a little more expensive than the others, but his work was more careful. These are the vats in which the slaves washed and degreased the cloth, trampling it with their feet in a solution of water mixed with soda.
Or maybe with urine, which cost less.
Not Veranius. His competitors would have told everyone. After the fabric was washed, they beat it with wooden mallets in order to soften it, and then it was rinsed in these tubs. Many cloth makers, Folones, also operated laundries, a very lucrative business. Having a tunic washed might run you 4 sesterces.
Pompeians didn't wash in the morning, but their tunics had to be neat and clean, keeping up appearances, right?
But we had a shave every single day. You would find tonsores, barbers, at every corner, wherever there was a fountain. A stool, a bowl, and a blade. The tools of the trade.
Only a stoic could enjoy a shave without soap or shaving cream or any kind of lotion. not to mention the constant danger of having your throat slit.
As a matter of fact, careless barbers were heavily fined. Still, there were plenty of slips of the knife. They would staunch the flow of blood by applying an ointment made of spiders' webs, soaked in oil and vinegar.
Which may explain why, when the Emperor Hadrian took to wearing a beard, Romans rushed to adopt the new fashion. It was to escape from the tortures of the tonsores.
After visiting the barber, I did the shopping. One of my slaves carried my purchases. This is where the purveyors of food held sway. Almost all of them had their stores in this street. I came here every day.
While your wife was at home getting dressed.
Look, this was our bakery, a combination of flour mill and baking oven. This was the wood-burning oven. Down there is where the flour was stored. In the middle there, the millstones for grinding the grain, run by slaves, naturally. The best bread in Pompeii came from right here.
There were 3 kinds of bread. Black bread for the plebs, the lowest class, a lighter bread for the middle class, and a soft white bread made from the tips of the wheat for the rich.
We had a different kind of equality in Pompeii. This, for example, is a lower-class neighborhood filled with stores, inns, even houses of ill repute. Well, rich and poor lived here side by side, without problems. Look, here is a house in which poor people lived. The house is small, dark, unadorned, a room on the ground floor and a ladder that takes you to a loft above. And just a few steps away stood the house of Pompidius Rufo, a wealthy businessman.
Rich and poor continued to live cheek by jowl that way until well into the Middle Ages. The segregation of neighborhoods of the wealthy and the poor is a much later invention.
Life in Pompeii was lived outside, in the streets.
A typical Mediterranean city.
A swarm of people and carts. Watch out for the ruts in the road.
Your aediles, the city administrators, were pretty far-sighted when they created these pedestrian islands, where vehicular traffic was prohibited.
This was one of the busiest thoroughfares. Stores, inns, street vendors. I loved it. It was like a perpetual holiday. There were tumblers and street musicians.
And beggars.
You could always find some idlers lolling about, acting as if they owned the street. Come on, let's cross over. I want to show you something.
Aha! An example of the engineering for which the Romans are so famous.
Just a simple pedestrian crossing, to slow the carts down and enable pedestrians to keep their feet dry when crossing the street in the rain.
Cuspium pansa popidium secundum ediles, dignos republice, oro vos faciatis.
Caium cuspium pansam edilem, aurifices universi rogant. Trebium edilem, oro vos faciatis.
Planari Rogan.
Uscum duovirum mi sedibus sacris publicis procurandis Asellinas arrogant. Nec sine Smirina! Smirina!
Look at that. This was like a local bulletin board with election slogans, announcements, notices of public performances.
The walls were like a kind of newspaper.
Most of the announcements were campaign rhetoric. The municipal elections were hotly contested.
It was Cicero who said, "It is easier to become a senator in Rome than a decurion in Pompeii."
There were craftsmen who specialized in these inscriptions.
The De Albatores.
First, they whitewashed the wall to blank out whatever was written before, and then painted in their new messages in elegant letters. They usually worked at night, by the light of a lantern mounted on a rod, and with someone holding the ladder from which they worked.
OVF. Oro vos fasciatis. Please give me your vote.
That was the customary phraseology, but candidates never promoted themselves. Their friends did it, well-to-do and respectable citizens who supported the candidacy.
They weren't always so respectable either. Hermetius, the bartender, and his companion, the wide-hipped Palmyra, urge you to vote for Pompedius Secundus. And this one, a madam and her girls, Egla the Greek and Maria the Hebrew, are supporting Elvius Sabinus. Candidates would evidently take their votes where they could find them.
A public official has to have the support of all levels of voters.
But what did they promise the voters?
Some candidates represented some pretty odd special interest groups. The Corporation of the Sleepyheads, the Drinkers to the End, the Association of Thieves, the Society of Fugitive Slaves. Ah, here we are, at the Forum. This was where all the discussions and arguments were held, in politics or business. Late mornings, it was always crowded. On that day, I came around 7, or a little earlier. You could hear all kinds of languages here, all kinds of dialects. In Pompeii, we spoke Latin, of course, but people also still spoke Greek or the ancient Oscan.
As a matter of fact, your Latin leaves something to be desired. You say domna instead of domina, and abiat in place of habeat.
This is where the public scribes used to work, with their little tablets. This was the official area, where the authorities would sit when the assembly was in session, where the public records were kept. But in August, things were pretty quiet in this part of the Forum. There was much more action in the section of the Eumachia, where the powerful association of Folones were headquartered, and where they did their wholesale business with buyers who came from far away.
This was a kind of mercantile exchange for wool.
Another center for commercial transactions was the Marcellum.
A parochial town, the market almost on top of the Forum.
It was a huge market. The stores were filled with goods of every kind. Outside, under the portico, they sold all kinds of foodstuffs, even live animals. But the Pompeians were an argumentative, distrustful lot, and doing business often led to disputes. As a matter of fact, the aediles maintained a mensa ponderaria, a table of weights, at the front of the market. An official was always on hand to make sure people got what they paid for. The mensa ponderaria was a simple marble table on which the official weights and measures were engraved. Everybody could check things out, but the table wasn't always enough. And then the argument would be removed to the basilica for more formal legal proceedings.
The law courts must have been full all the time, considering the notoriously litigious nature of the Romans.
Actually, most of the people in the basilica weren't litigants, but spectators who went to watch the action. They loved watching lawsuits. It was like going to the theater. That's where the magistrates sat. On the benches, the contending parties, the witnesses, the lawyers, and a crowd of spectators who took sides, got all worked up, commented loudly, or applauded.
The lawyers actually brought their own claques, the laudicani, to applaud their orations.
Sometimes a lawyer couldn't even make his case because he was drowned out by the laudicani of the opposing party.
Roman justice was supposed to be very sober and even-handed, but in fact it was administered in a rather undignified manner.
I was walking past the basilica that morning.
You came to watch your favorite lawyer.
Omnes nos verba facimus, aliquid fetimus, neque unius rei causa quisquam ad vos prodit.
Every time I thought he was finished, he took another breath and went on.
I know what you mean. One of these orations could run 5 hours.
Exactly. And I had to go to the baths.
Your first stop was the Thermopolium.
After a quick bite of cheese and cooked greens. We didn't eat much at lunchtime. Often it was leftovers from dinner the night before.
All those stories about Roman feasting are a bit exaggerated then.
Besides, I wanted to be in good physical shape and not logy when I got to the baths. These are the baths that I liked best, the Termi Stabiani. The place had everything. Baths, a gym, a place to meet your friends. These niches were for keeping your clothes. This was mine. Under these porticos, after a bath, you could stroll, relax in body and spirit, and talk with your friends.
There's a sense of grandeur to these baths. Marble, sculptures, bas-reliefs. A sense of luxury that made ordinary people believe that they were well off.
This is the Tepidarium. The water was lukewarm, midway between the Frigidarium and the Calidarium.
The relaxing warm air was heated by steam, circulated from inside a cavity in the walls.
This is the Calidarium, a kind of large furnace. You had to wear wooden sandals in here, or your feet would burn, because the stone floors were almost glowingly hot. Part of the baths was set aside for women, but the sexes weren't separated all that rigidly, and there were plenty of times when ladies, properly dressed, of course, would visit the much larger and more comfortable sections that were supposed to be for men only.
As far as sexual mores go, the Pompeians were pretty broad-minded. It was not at all unheard of for rich ladies of respectable family to visit the gladiators' barracks.
The palestra, the gym. This is where men and women mixed. It was wonderful to see the naked young men wrestling or sparring. There was no sense of anything sexually suggestive. It was an athletic contest.
Sports and athletic contests were more in the Greek than the Roman tradition. The Romans thought of physical exercise more as a health measure.
True enough, it felt good to exercise and then sink into the hot water, or to get the body going again afterward. Ball games were the favorite exercise. The ball was filled with feathers or with sand. More violent forms of exercise were boxing, using a bag filled with earth, or thrusting a sword into a tree trunk. After a good stay at the baths, I made my way back to my house for dinner.
On this particular August day, though, you didn't go straight home.
I stopped off to try my luck with the dice at the Capona of Trebius Valento.
Gambling was, in fact, forbidden, but that didn't keep you from indulging in it. And the inns were all betting parlors.
Not all of them. The riskiest of all the games was dice,
Which in this particular place were loaded. The house made sure it won by putting a small piece of lead inside the dice.
You could find swindlers everywhere. Look what a customer wrote on this wall. "Bartender, you gave me water and charged for wine."
Winaria Hedonia was a more honest hostess. Above her door she wrote, "He who drinks 1 ass's worth drinks better for 2, and real wine for 4.
Do you know the game Micatio? 6, 8, 3. How much will you bet?
Rich, self-important Pompeian patricians apparently saw nothing wrong with sitting down and pitching coins with muleteers.
And what's wrong with that? Pompeians were not class-conscious.
If you were caught gambling, the fines were heavy, 4 times the amount of the stakes.
The innkeeper made sure they weren't caught.
On that fateful afternoon, you were headed for Trebius's tavern to spend a little time with that girl, Smirina.
Who, me? Never.
There wasn't a tavern in Pompeii that didn't provide the services of a group of young girls. They came mostly from Asia Minor, and some of them were extremely attractive. And all of the taverns had straw pallets, where a customer might retire with the girl of his dreams, so to speak. The baths, the gym, the tavern, that's where the hard-working Pompeians spent their afternoons.
Mornings were when we did the work.
Every other morning, anyway. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there were 182 holidays a year.
Let's count them up. 12 Ides, 6 Calends, 3 Nones. That's 21. Then the Feriae Publicae, the public festivals. The Lupercalia, Cerialia, Saturnalia. 15 days each, that's another 45 days. Then the Ludi, the games. 124 days. Not to mention the special holidays that an emperor might announce to celebrate his coronation or a victory, or just to please the people.
Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The Roman emperors were lavish with holidays and cheap entertainment. That's how they kept the lid on popular discontent.
On holidays, everybody went to the temple. This is the one I used to go to. It was dedicated to Apollo, one of the gods we most revered. The earthquake in the year 62 destroyed the temple, but we rebuilt it more beautiful than before.
Corinthian columns replaced the earlier Ionic style, and stucco decorations were added. Beautifully done, lavish, in good taste, appropriately solemn, but no proof at all of any real piety in Pompeii.
What do you mean?
The Romans were not a very religious people, particularly in their temples, where the representations of the gods had become conventional and without expression, pale imitations of the Greek gods with which the Roman pantheon had merged.
But on holy days, the temples were always full.
Roman religion was really just a collection of cults, with people free to worship in their own ways. a practical and not a spiritual religion, worshipping power and not divinity. Take the example of Marcus Tullius, who had a temple built on his own property to honor Fortuna Augusta, and his own benefactor, the Emperor Augustus.
Arcum casellium et lusum albusum ediles oro vos facam. Caium lolium fuscum duovirum vi sedibus sacri.
And, by the way, during holidays, the arenas and amphitheaters attracted far bigger crowds than the temples.
That's true. Crowds began to pour into the amphitheater before daybreak in order to get good seats. They brought food and drinks with them and camped out until the games or the gladiatorial combats began. One of the most popular politicians in Pompeii was a man named Aulus Nigidius Maio, who paid for gladiators out of his own pocket 4 times.
It seems strange that a people as highly civilized as the Romans would find such terrible brutality entertaining.
The crowds of spectators would be whipped into a fever of passion. Once a squabble began between Pompeians and some out-of-towners, which quickly turned into a wholesale riot. A lot of people were injured and even killed.
That was in the year 59 A.D.
The matter was brought up in the Senate in Rome, which decreed that Pompeii would be forbidden to hold any gladiatorial contests in its amphitheater for the next 10 years. On holidays, the theaters were full, too. There were 5,000 seats. That was the orchestra. Over there, on stage, the actors. Over there, the fixed scenery, like statues and columns.
The performances in the theaters were just as cruel as the gladiatorial combats.
Why do you say that?
If the script called for torturing a poor slave, he was actually tortured on stage.
Well, yes. But the ones who were tortured weren't actors. They were criminals whose punishment was being carried out.
And the audience relished every moment of it. During a performance of the death of Hercules, the audience burst into applause when a slave was burned alive on stage.
But there were other kinds of performances, too. Comedians.
Those were vulgar, most of them, even scurrilous.
The Pompeians loved to watch the Atellani.
That's because they enjoyed the stock characters, the mimes, and particularly the obscene gestures.
If they preferred mimes, it was because the theater was large and the audience restless and noisy, so you couldn't hear what the actors were saying. As a matter of fact, in Pompeii, actors were considered artists, while in Rome, they were treated with disdain.
Actresses, on the other hand, had no social status. They weren't taken seriously at all, and were treated as little more than courtesans.
Maybe because they often stripped on stage. On the whole, women played an important role in the life of Pompeii. During election campaigns, for example, they would actively work in support of a candidate. We were all enormously proud of our fellow Pompeian, Poppaea, when she became the wife of the emperor.
Maybe that's why the Pompeians were such ardent supporters of Nero.
Look at this splendid villa. It belonged to Julia Felicia, a woman who had a very astute sense of business.
and was the object of a lot of slanderous gossip, to judge by the salacious graffiti over her front door.
Provincial childishness. The Villa Giulia was very posh, very grand. In the middle of the city, she had a huge garden with flowers, hedges, tall trees, fountains.
The gardens in Pompeii were beautiful, not as manicured as the Roman gardens, more as if you were in the country.
The villa had its own private baths, which Giulia rented out for a fee. This is the inscription outside. For rent on the property belonging to Julia Felicia, daughter of Spurius. Baths for Pompeian boys. Shops with sleeping quarters, apartments. 5-year lease available. This is a typical summer triclinium. This was where the master of the house reclined. The slaves served meals from the middle. The tables were set very expensively. Silver vessels, gold cups inlaid with diamonds.
Wealthy Pompeians liked to show off their riches by setting their tables with the most expensive objects they could lay their hands on.
Actually, it was the wines that distinguished a dinner. The quality of the wine and the number of different kinds of wine. 20, even 30 different kinds. Different wines flavored to complement each dish that was served at the meal.
A man would show how good a host he was by the range of flavored wines he offered. Wines tasting of cinnamon or saffron or myrrh.
A good kitchen was judged by its garum.
Fish marinated in brine and fermented? Ugh.
The garum Pompeianum was exported throughout the Roman Empire. Umbricius Scauro made an absolute fortune with a delicious garum made from fermented mackerel. Packed in jars and sealed with his own seal, his garum was shipped everywhere. Garum was a feast for the palate, just as the decorations in the triclinium were a feast for the eyes. For the most part, Pompeians preferred mosaics or frescoes, with subjects drawn from nature and depicted in warm, bright colors.
The Pompeian frescoes are lavish rather than delicate. They imitate nature, seeking to create the illusion of reality. Imaginary gardens and porticos rendered realistically. Gods in which nobody believed anymore. Or they amuse themselves by having their own rooms painted with obscene illustrations. In their paintings and their mosaics, Pompeians were bent on showing off their wealth. Staring at us so complacently from these walls, they could not have imagined how hollow their lives would appear to us after nearly 2,000 years.
Later on in the evening, we might have dinner at a villa out of town.
The ordinary Pompeian made quick shrift of his dinner. After sundown, no one in his right mind would venture out alone into the unlit streets.
On this August evening, I was going to dinner in the villa of Epidius, outside the gates of Herculaneum. The air was still heavy and oppressive, but in the shade of the large arbor, the air was fresh and sweet. The meal promised to be exquisite. The wine cellar, the largest and best stocked in all of Pompeii. And Epidius's cooks were famous for their sauces.
Incredibly complicated sauces. Africius claimed to be able to recognize 450 distinct sauces. Piquant, sweet, hot, strong enough to mask the flavor of the foods with which they were served.
My favorites were the sauces made with honey and mixed with vinegar and mint. That night there was an excellent one that accompanied a dish of stuffed boar. It was the highlight of the whole dinner. Everyone at the table agreed.
Everyone slurping, burping, throwing up. Their table manners were disgusting.
The wines that Epidius served from his cellar increased everyone's good humor. We began with a superb wine mellowed with honey.
It must be said that the Pompeians had excellent taste in wine. They were true connoisseurs.
There were jesters and clowns to entertain the dinner guests, acrobats, singing. There were even 2 dancers with wonderfully flexible, lithe bodies. It was a wonderful, light-hearted meal. Epidius made excellent conversation. We were talking about Publius Ostorius's victories in the recent games when we heard a kind of muted roar. Then another, and yet another. It sounded as if an earthquake were about to happen, the way it had 17 years earlier.
It was, in fact, the sign that the end had come. No one could have known what was going to happen. At 10 o'clock on the following day, August 24, 79 A.D., Pompeii ceased to exist. The volcano completely buried the city and all its inhabitants under a blanket of ashes and stones.
Huge flames leaped from Mount Vesuvius, their brilliance intensified by the utter darkness. Continued and prolonged tremors shook the houses and almost tore them from their foundations, seeming to lift and then put them down again. It was daytime, but darkness reigned, a night darker and deeper than any other.
In this darkness, the Pompeians died in the act of living, the slave with his lantern and his bag, the frightened children, the woman with a bundle of jewels, the freedman with a few items grabbed in panic, the oldest son, head covered by the shirt with which his nurse had tried to protect him. And you, citizen of Pompeii, stretched toward the light you would never see again. You and your monument, Pompeii.